I used to think stealth meant silence, that moving undetected through hostile territory was just about making no noise, leaving no tracks, becoming invisible to the naked eye. I thought it was a skill you could master with enough training, enough discipline, enough time in the bush. And for years, across multiple theaters of war, that belief held firm. Special operations forces from around the world prided themselves on their ability to slip through enemy lines, gather intelligence, strike without warning, and vanish before the smoke cleared. But in the jungles of Vietnam, between 1966 and 1971, a different kind of operator emerged. They didn't just move through the jungle, they became it. To the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars, who controlled vast stretches of Phuoc Tuy Province, these soldiers were known as Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. And they were the enemy the communists feared most. They were the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, and what they did in those green hell canopies changed how the world understood reconnaissance warfare. The story begins in the rubber plantations of Nui Dat, an Australian base carved out of Viet Cong stronghold territory in the central region of Phuoc Tuy Province. Established in May 1966, Nui Dat sat roughly 30 kilometers from the coastal port of Vung Tau, positioned deliberately in the heart of enemy country. The first Australian task force, known as 1ATF, had chosen this location precisely because it was surrounded by communist forces. The nearby villages of Long Tan and Long Phuoc were Viet Cong strongholds, their residents either sympathetic to or actively part of the insurgency that had turned South Vietnam into a battlefield. Securing this base required more than conventional infantry patrols. It demanded eyes that could see into the deepest jungle, ears that could detect movement kilometers away, and soldiers who could operate for days or weeks behind enemy lines without support, without resupply, without making a single sound that would give away their position. The Australian command knew exactly who to call. The Special Air Service Regiment had been formed in July 1957, modeled directly on the British SAS, with whom they shared the motto, "Who dares wins." Initially established as a single company of just 180 men, the unit had grown into a full regiment by August 1964, consisting of 3 Sabre squadrons, a base squadron, and a signal squadron. Their first real test had come in the jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation in 1965 and 66, where they conducted secret cross-border reconnaissance missions and learned the brutal art of jungle warfare in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. That experience in Borneo would prove invaluable, because Vietnam was going to demand something even more extreme. When 3rd Squadron became the first SASR unit to deploy to Vietnam in April 1966, they arrived at a war that was already spiraling into chaos. American forces were pouring into the country by the hundreds of thousands, conducting massive search and destroy operations backed by overwhelming firepower. Artillery barrages, bombing raids, helicopter gunships, armor columns pushing through villages. The American doctrine relied on superior technology, communications networks, and the ability to call down devastating fire support whenever contact was made with the enemy. The Australians had a different philosophy. They had learned in Malaya and Borneo that counterinsurgency warfare required patience, precision, and an understanding that the jungle itself was both enemy and ally. You couldn't bomb your way to victory against an opponent who lived in tunnel networks, who moved at night, who knew every trail and stream and hiding place in terrain they'd fought over for generations. You had to go into their world. You had to become better at being invisible than they were. And the SAS took this philosophy to an extreme that bordered on supernatural. Their patrols were small, typically 4 to 6 men, though 5 became the standard configuration. Each patrol had a specific structure designed for maximum efficiency with minimal footprint. There was the lead scout, the eyes of the patrol, moving point and reading the jungle for signs of danger. Behind him came the patrol commander, making tactical decisions in real time without radio consultation. Then the second in command, ready to take over if the commander was killed or wounded. The signaller carried the radio, their lifeline to base, though, as we'll see, they used it far less than anyone else in theater. And finally, the medic, trained to handle everything from gunshot wounds to snake bites with limited supplies deep in hostile territory. Sometimes a New Zealand SAS trooper was integrated into the patrol, part of a close partnership that saw Kiwi soldiers attached to each Australian squadron from late 1968 onward. These men trained together, fought together, lived together in conditions that would break most conventional soldiers. They operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province and beyond, pushing into Bien Hoa, Long Khan, and Binh Tuy provinces, ranging across areas that belonged entirely to the enemy. Their insertion methods varied depending on the mission. Most commonly, they used helicopters from No. 9 Squadron RAAF, Iroquois utility choppers that had become synonymous with the Vietnam War. The pilots of 9 Squadron were masters of their craft, capable of threading their aircraft through jungle canopies to deposit patrols in landing zones barely large enough for the skids, sometimes hovering above the trees while men rappelled down ropes into the green darkness below. These insertions typically happened at dusk, using the fading light to mask the patrol's entry into enemy territory. But the Viet Cong weren't stupid. After several years of SAS operations, they learned to recognize the patterns. They began positioning forces near likely insertion points, waiting to ambush patrols immediately after they landed. The SAS response was characteristically cunning. They developed what they called cowboy insertions. A helicopter carrying the actual patrol would be followed by a second Iroquois with another team. Both patrols would land, move together for 5 minutes, then the second patrol would halt and wait. If no contact occurred, the second team would return to the landing zone for extraction, while the first patrol continued its mission. If the enemy attacked, they'd find themselves facing twice the force they expected, and the element of surprise would shift dramatically. Sometimes patrols were inserted via M113 armored personnel carriers, the rumbling APCs making enough noise to alert every Viet Cong sentry for kilometers. But the Australians turned this apparent disadvantage into deception, developing methods to mask the actual drop-off point of the patrol despite the obvious noise signature. The carriers would continue past the patrol's debarkation point, creating the impression that all troops remained mounted, while the SAS team melted into the jungle behind them. Once on the ground, the real work began. An SAS patrol moved differently than any other unit in Vietnam. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRRPs, were excellent soldiers trained in similar missions. Ma CV SOG teams running cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia were among the most elite operators in the theater. But even these hardened veterans were stunned when they observed the Australians at work. The SAS didn't move through the jungle. They flowed through it, like water finding paths through stone. Their pace was deliberate, sometimes covering only 500 meters in an entire day. While conventional infantry might patrol several kilometers in a morning, SAS teams measured progress in meters per hour, sometimes less. Every step was calculated. The lead scout would test the ground before committing his weight, feeling for twigs that might snap, loose stones that might shift, anything that would create sound. He moved from root to root, rock to rock, avoiding soft earth that would leave boot prints or disturb vegetation. The rest of the patrol followed in his exact footsteps, each man placing his boots in the impressions left by the man ahead. This single-file movement in one another's tracks meant that 5 men left the footprint signature of 1, making tracking them far more difficult for enemy trackers who might cross their path. They communicated almost entirely without words. Hand signals were minimal, just slight movements of fingers that could mean halt, danger, enemy contact, direction change, or weapons ready. But even hand signals were used sparingly because they required visual contact between patrol members, which meant raising your head or shifting position, which meant movement that could be detected. Instead, they relied on something deeper. Pre-mission rehearsals drilled every potential scenario so thoroughly that reactions became instinctive. If the patrol commander adjusted course by 3 degrees, every man behind him adjusted by the same amount without being told, reading the change in direction from the spacing and orientation of the man ahead. If the lead scout froze, everyone froze in the same instant, not because they saw him stop, but because they felt the disruption in the rhythm of movement, the sudden absence of sound where footsteps had been. This level of coordination required extraordinary discipline and an almost telepathic awareness of your teammates. The patrols trained together for months before deployment, learning each other's breathing patterns, walking rhythms, nervous habits. By the time they entered the jungle, they operated as a single organism with 5 sets of senses, processing information collectively and responding with unified precision that looked choreographed, but was actually the result of hundreds of hours of rehearsal. Their camouflage went far beyond standard uniform patterns. Before each patrol, the men would apply what they called cam cream, dark paint that broke up the recognizable contours of the human face. But they went further. They studied the specific vegetation of their operational area, noting the exact shades of green, brown, and gray that dominated the local environment. Then they adjusted their cam patterns to match, sometimes mixing mud from the patrol area itself into their face paint to perfectly replicate the local soil color. Their uniforms were a mix of tiger stripe patterns and olive drab, often supplemented with pieces of natural foliage tucked into webbing and secured to equipment. These weren't random branches shoved through gear loops. The vegetation was selected to match the local flora, replaced regularly as it dried or wilted, positioned to break up the human silhouette from every angle. An SAS soldier lying motionless in the undergrowth became genuinely difficult to spot even from a few meters away, his outline dissolving into the chaos of jungle ground cover. Their movement through hostile territory followed strict protocols designed to eliminate trace evidence. They walked on exposed routes whenever possible, using the hard wood to avoid leaving footprints in soft earth. When crossing streams, they entered and exited on rocky sections rather than muddy banks. They avoided touching vegetation at face level, where broken branches or disturbed leaves would be obvious to anyone following their trail. If they had to push through dense growth, they did it slowly, allowing branches to spring back naturally rather than snapping them or leaving them bent at unnatural angles. When they stopped to rest or observe, they took extraordinary care with their temporary positions. Equipment was never set. down directly on the ground where it might leave compression marks. Personal waste, even spit, was buried. Cigarette butts, food wrappers, any evidence of human presence was either carried out or buried deep enough that casual examination wouldn't reveal it. Some patrols went so far as to cover their resting positions with natural debris after moving on, reconstructing the jungle floor so perfectly that even experienced trackers couldn't determine where they'd been. The Viet Cong had controlled Phuoc Tuy Province for years before the Australians arrived. They knew every trail, every water source, every good ambush position. They had sympathy and support among many of the local population. They moved freely, confident in their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to detect foreign intrusion into their territory. And then the phantoms arrived. One of the most remarkable accounts from this period describes an SAS patrol that inadvertently crept into a Viet Cong firing range, an alley cut through dense undergrowth where enemy soldiers practiced their marksmanship. The lead scout realized his mistake only when he found himself parallel to the firing line, with targets downrange and communist soldiers just meters away. He couldn't move. Any sound, any motion would give away his position and likely result in his immediate death. So he stayed for 3 days. 3 days lying in the same position, barely breathing, while Viet Cong fighters fired weapons, talked, ate meals, and went about their training just meters from where he lay hidden. 3 days without food, without water beyond what was in his canteen, without the ability to shift position to relieve cramping muscles or adjust gear digging into his flesh. When the range finally went quiet, and he was certain the enemy had departed, he extracted himself and made his way back to the patrol's rally point. This wasn't exceptional by SAS standards. It was just another day in the jungle. Another patrol member found himself concealed in thick brush when a Viet Cong soldier stopped directly beside his position to urinate. The Australian remained absolutely frozen, weapon ready, while enemy urine splashed onto the vegetation covering him. One movement, one sound, even one wrong breath could end his life. The Viet Cong soldier finished, adjusted his equipment, and moved on, completely unaware that he just relieved himself onto a foreign soldier who could have killed him but chose invisibility over violence. These stories spread through the American Special Operations community and generated a kind of respectful awe. The U.S. Army long-range reconnaissance patrols began requesting to attach personnel to SAS missions, wanting to learn these techniques firsthand. May-CV SOG operators, themselves among the most elite soldiers in theater, asked Australian SAS instructors to teach courses at the Recondo School in Ha Trang, where reconnaissance commandos were trained. The Australian methods were soon being copied throughout Vietnam. But there was one element that couldn't be fully replicated, one aspect of SAS operations that set them apart from every other unit in country: their relationship with technology. American forces in Vietnam relied heavily on communications equipment. Radio nets connected squads to platoons, platoons to companies, companies to battalions. Fire support coordination required constant radio traffic. Artillery missions, airstrikes, medical evacuations, resupply requests, all of it depended on functioning radios and the operators who used them. Lose your radio, and you were cut off, vulnerable, unable to call for help or report critical intelligence. The SAS carried radios, but they used them differently. Where American patrols might conduct radio checks every 30 minutes to confirm position and status, SAS patrols would go hours or even days without transmitting. Their signaller carried the equipment, certainly, but it was a backup system, a last resort for emergency extraction or reporting critical time-sensitive intelligence that couldn't wait until the patrol returned to base. Otherwise, they maintained radio silence. This created interesting situations when SAS patrols worked alongside American LRRP teams. The Americans would key their handsets for scheduled check-ins, reporting position, status, observations. The Australians would watch in quiet amazement, unable to understand why anyone would voluntarily announce their presence with electronic emissions that could potentially be detected or triangulated by enemy signal intelligence. When asked about this, one SAS patrol commander explained his philosophy simply: "If we need to call for help, something has already gone catastrophically wrong. Our mission is to not be found. Radios are for when we've failed at that." This extended to their entire operational approach. They didn't carry extensive communications equipment, spare batteries, encryption devices, all the technological infrastructure that American units considered essential. Instead, they carried extra ammunition, more grenades, additional medical supplies, and most importantly, less total weight that allowed them to move faster when necessary and maintain absolute silence when required. Their planning process reflected this minimalist approach. Before a mission, the patrol would spend days studying maps, aerial photographs, intelligence reports, anything that could give them detailed knowledge of their operational area. They memorized terrain features, likely enemy positions, water sources, rally points, emergency extraction zones. By the time they inserted, every man knew exactly where they were going, what they were looking for, and how to get back without needing to consult maps or coordinates. The patrol commander navigated using terrain association, reading the landscape and comparing it to memorized information rather than constantly checking maps and compasses. A particular ridge, line, a distinctive tree, the slope of the ground underfoot, these became navigation references. The rest of the patrol followed, trusting completely in the commander's ability to keep them on track. This trust was absolute and essential. In conventional units, soldiers might question orders, ask for clarification, seek confirmation of plans. In an SAS patrol operating deep behind enemy lines, there was no time for discussion or debate. The patrol commander made decisions, and everyone followed instantly, because hesitation could mean detection, and detection could mean death. The missions themselves varied in scope and objective. Sometimes the task was pure reconnaissance, inserting into an area to observe and report enemy activity without engaging. These patrols would establish observation posts overlooking trails or suspected base areas, recording every movement, counting enemy soldiers, noting equipment types, documenting supply cache locations. They might spend 5 or 6 days in position, watching through binoculars and rifle scopes, taking notes, building intelligence that would later inform larger operations. Other missions were reconnaissance-ambush hybrids, where the patrol would conduct surveillance until a suitable target presented itself, then spring a violent attack before withdrawing rapidly. These engagements were carefully chosen. The SAS didn't attack unless they had overwhelming tactical advantage. They didn't fight fair. They struck when the enemy was most vulnerable, maximizing casualties while minimizing risk to the patrol, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Their ambush tactics became legendary. Unlike conventional ambushes that might involve a platoon or company positioned along a trail, SAS ambushes used just 5 or 6 men to devastating effect. They positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that every member of the enemy force would be caught in a crossfire with no escape route. They used claymore mines, directional explosives packed with steel balls that could shred human bodies at close range. They carried M60 machine guns, M16 rifles, grenade launchers, creating a volume of fire that made a five-man patrol sound like a much larger force. This was intentional. The SAS wanted the enemy to think they'd encountered a reinforced platoon, not a handful of operators. The psychological effect was significant. Viet Cong and NVA forces that survived SAS ambushes would report contact with large Australian units, spreading fear and uncertainty about the actual strength of forces operating in their territory. When the ambush was sprung, it lasted seconds. A wall of fire erupting from seemingly empty jungle, devastating the enemy column. Then silence. By the time the surviving enemy soldiers recovered enough to return fire, the SAS patrol was already withdrawing, moving through pre-planned routes that led to extraction points where helicopters from 9 Squadron would be inbound, ready to pull them out. These extractions were often conducted under fire, with Viet Cong forces pursuing the patrol or attempting to shoot down the rescue helicopters. The RAF pilots earned tremendous respect from the SAS for their willingness to fly into hot landing zones, hovering exposed while men clambered aboard, absorbing ground fire that punched holes through the thin skin of their aircraft. More than one pilot took rounds through his cockpit while holding position long enough for a patrol to board, refusing to abandon men on the ground regardless of personal risk. The kill ratio achieved by the SAS was extraordinary by any measure. Over their 6 years in Vietnam, Australian and New Zealand SAS patrols conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. They killed at least 492 Viet Cong and NVA soldiers confirmed, with another 106 possible kills, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses were remarkably light. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing in action whose remains weren't recovered until August 2008, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded in action. Compare this to conventional infantry units operating in the same province during the same period, and the difference is stark. The SAS achieved the highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire Vietnam War, Australian or otherwise, while suffering minimal casualties themselves. This wasn't luck. It was the result of extraordinary training, meticulous planning, tactical discipline, and an operational philosophy that prioritized survival through invisibility rather than survival through firepower. But perhaps the most telling indicator of their effectiveness was how the enemy saw them. The Viet Cong gave them the name Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. This wasn't a casual nickname. It was spoken with genuine fear and respect. Communist fighters who had faced American infantry, Marines, paratroopers who had survived artillery barrages and bombing raids and armor assaults spoke of the Australian SAS with a kind of superstitious dread. One former Viet Cong fighter, interviewed decades after the war, described her unit's fear of the Australians. "We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. Not killed in battle, not captured in raids, but disappeared. Soldiers would be on patrol one day and simply never return. Their bodies never found. No signs of struggle, nothing but silence, where 5 men had been walking." This psychological dimension of SAS operations can't be overstated. The Viet Cong controlled the night in most of Vietnam, moving freely after dark when American forces withdrew to defensive positions. But the Australian SAS operated at night with the same confidence they showed during the day, slipping through enemy-controlled areas in total darkness, setting ambushes on trails the Viet Cong thought were safe, appearing in places that should have been impossible to reach undetected. The effect was to make the Viet Cong fearful of their own territory. Trails they'd used for years became suspect. Rally points they'd considered secure were suddenly vulnerable. The jungle that had been their sanctuary became a place where invisible death might be watching, waiting, ready to strike without warning. This fear spread through word of mouth, growing with each retelling, and the SAS did nothing to discourage it. If the enemy wanted to believe they were dealing with supernatural soldiers who could walk through walls and read minds, that was fine. Fear was a weapon as effective as any rifle. By 1970, as American forces began their gradual withdrawal from Vietnam, the SAS were still operating at peak effectiveness. 1st Squadron returned for its second tour in February 1970, finding that Viet Cong activity in Phuoc Tuy Province had decreased significantly, partly due to 5 years of constant SAS pressure that had made the area increasingly difficult for enemy forces to operate in. But this success created new challenges. With fewer enemy forces in the immediate area, patrols had to range farther into Viet Tuy Province and other regions to make contact. Some patrols went months without enemy sightings, conducting reconnaissance of areas that had been cleared or abandoned. The war was winding down, at least for the Australians, and the frustration of deploying elite soldiers into situations where they couldn't find the enemy began to wear on morale. In October 1971, 2nd Squadron conducted the final SAS operations in Vietnam before the Australian withdrawal. On their return to Australia, the squadron was disbanded, its personnel redistributed to allow the formation of what would become Operational Support Squadron. The SAS era in Vietnam ended quietly, without fanfare, with 580 men having served in country over 5.5 years. Their legacy extended far beyond the statistics and mission reports. The techniques they refined in Vietnam became core doctrine for Special Operations Forces worldwide. The emphasis on stealth over firepower, patience over speed, invisibility over presence, all of this influenced how modern reconnaissance units train and operate. American Special Operations Forces adopted many Australian methods, integrating them into LRRP training and later into the formation of units like the 75th Ranger Regiment. British SAS, already closely aligned with their Australian counterparts, studied the Vietnam experience and incorporated lessons learned into their own doctrine. Even conventional forces began to understand that sometimes the most effective military action is the one the enemy never sees coming. The men who served with the SAS in Vietnam rarely spoke about their experiences publicly. The nature of their work, the classified missions, the sensitive operations that couldn't be discussed even decades after the war ended, all of this created a culture of silence that extended well beyond their military service. Many returned to civilian life and never told their families exactly what they'd done in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy. But among the Special Operations community, their reputation was unmatched. When veterans from different nations gathered and war stories were shared, the Australians who'd operated in Vietnam were treated with particular respect. They'd done something that few others could claim. They'd fought a counterinsurgency war on the enemy's terms, in terrain that favored the defender, against an opponent who'd been fighting for generations, and they'd not just survived, but dominated. The story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam is ultimately about human capability pushed to its absolute limit, about what soldiers can achieve when survival depends on becoming something more than soldiers, when the mission requires transforming into elements of the landscape itself. It's about 5 men moving as one, trusting each other absolutely, operating without the safety net of conventional support, deep in enemy territory where detection meant death. They were called Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, and the name was earned through thousands of hours spent motionless in the heat, through days of moving 500 meters through terrain where others would cover 5 kilometers, through the absolute discipline required to watch an enemy soldier urinate on you and do nothing, say nothing, be nothing but shadow and silence. They didn't just operate in the jungle, they became part of it, as natural and deadly as any predator that had ever hunted in those green depths. And when they vanished into the mist after the war ended, they left behind a legacy that changed how the world understands the art of being unseen, because the greatest warriors aren't always the ones who fight the hardest. Sometimes they're the ones the enemy never sees until it's far too late, the ones who hunt ghosts, the ones who are ghosts. The Australian SAS in Vietnam proved that the most dangerous soldiers in the world aren't the ones with the most firepower, or the best technology, or the largest numbers. They're the ones who can disappear completely, move without trace, strike without warning, and vanish without leaving any evidence they were ever there. That's not just special operations. That's something beyond tactics or training. That's becoming one with the environment you operate in, achieving a level of fieldcraft that borders on the supernatural. And in the jungles of Vietnam, for 6 years, that's exactly what they did.